Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the chapel here at the Queen's Foundation. This is a theological college for ecumenical education located in Edgbaston, Birmingham. So for many decades, many have come for ministerial training and theological education. So it's a good place to come for your theological training. There's a plug. I also want to extend a welcome to our audience online, watching and listening across the UK and overseas. This is a Black History Month special presented by the Black Theology Forum in the Centre for Black Theology here at Queen's in partnership with the Sam Sharpe Project. Together, we are hosting the Sam Sharpe Lecture 2024. The Sam Sharpe Lecture was launched in 2012, and since then it has been an annual event that tours the UK to promote the legacy of Sam Sharpe. Who was Sam Sharpe? Sam Sharpe was a Jamaican Baptist deacon, credited as the main instigator of the slave rebellion in 1831 in Jamaica, which was largely instrumental in bringing about the abolition of slavery. So today, Sam Sharpe is one of Jamaica's national heroes. Each year since 2012, the Sam Sharpe Project hosts an annual lecture to promote the story and advance the legacy of the great Sam Sharpe. So a theologian or another thinker or an activist of the African Caribbean diaspora is invited to speak into our shared reality through the lens of Sam Sharpe on topics linked to mission, race, class, and injustice. This year, the lecturer is a native of the Caribbean island of Bahamas and is a former student of Queen's, who I will introduce very shortly. But for now, for you online, we're really pleased that you are able to join us with your questions and comments. So what we're going to ask you to do is to send us your questions by way of scanning the QR code. You can send your comments anonymously, or you can create a profile giving us your name. So that's totally your choice. And we will respond to your questions during Q&A. And if you get stuck, please do email cbt@queens.ac.uk. So without further ado, let's move on with this evening's program. And the first thing we're going to have is a warm greeting from Jamaica. Reverend Carl Johnson is here especially to do that. So he traveled in, I believe, yesterday, going back tomorrow. Reverend Johnson is a Jamaican born, a minister of religion, a member of the Jamaican Baptist Union, and previously served as a General Secretary of the Jamaican Baptist Union. He's also a member of the Sam Sharpe Project, so let's make him feel very welcome, Reverend Carl Johnson.
I have to say that I need to take you all back to Jamaica with me. That rousing welcome does not await me in Jamaica. The Sam Sharpe Lecture Series is one of the few events that I personally anticipate every year. It is, for me, one of the avenues through which people of the African diaspora are able to tell their story themselves. And I'd like to underline that, for too often we have allowed others to tell our story. And we have to recover and rediscover the power in our story. And Sam Sharpe stands as a towering figure and a lasting inspirational figure in reminding us of the power that God has endowed on all of us. And for us as black people. Sam Sharpe didn't live long. Sam Sharpe was not revered as one of the high-ranking members of society. But Sam Sharpe had what most of us are lacking: a clear vision of who he was and an undying courage to stand up for who he was. Would to God that this lecture series would not just be an annual academic rhetorical exercise, but that more Sam Sharpes will be fanned into flame to challenge a world, challenge a system which remains embedded in injustice. We need more voices and more persons like Sam Sharpe. I greet you then from the land of Sam Sharpe and encourage you, #Stay Sharpe.
Thank you, Reverend Carl Johnson. Now for our lecture. The lecturer for the Sam Sharpe Lecture 2024 is Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner. Dr. Turner is a tutor in contextual theology and mission studies, as well as the Deputy Director of Research here at the Queen's Foundation here in Birmingham. Dr. Turner self-defines as a Caribbean contextual and practical theologian and engages in further research into the intersections of Christian theology and decoloniality, particularly within the British imperial history and context. His first book, Overcoming Self-Negation, explores the identity and church practices within the Anglophone African Caribbean, and his most recent book, Caribbean Contextual Theology, an introduction, is the latest iteration of a Caribbean theological reflection. Dr. Turner is a Bohemian Anglican priest, a proud Bohemian Anglican priest, and a theologian who sits on both the Faith and Order Commission of the Church of England, as well as the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches. He is often lecturing or presenting on issues around reparations, decolonization, racial inequality, and colonial oppression as they relate to contemporary church practices. The Caribbean holds a special place in Dr. Turner's heart, particularly its cultural diversity. His passions include John Canoe and carnival festivals and salsa. There is more, but we haven't got time. The title for his lecture this evening for the Sam Sharpe Lecture 2024 is this: Fighting for Freedom, Fighting for Wholeness, Revolutionary Reactions to Colonial Christianity. Please help me welcome Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner.
When you trace your life and you hear all these things, you must say God has been good and God has been faithful. I'm an academic, but I'm also a priest. Let's pray. Holy God, thank you for this time. Thank you for the legacies and the witness of those who stood up for your vision, for who we can be. In this moment, may our minds open and be transformed, but also our hearts. And give me your grace, your gifts, as I dare to speak in your name. your way. In Jesus' name, amen. Good evening. Good evening to you and good evening to those online. I have a lot to say, and let's begin. There's a fundamental question that really haunts my life, and it pursues me in academic, ecclesial spaces, no matter what it is. And it's this: what kind of Christianity do I inhabit? Is it healthy? Is it fostering existential wholeness? And if not, how do I deal with it? Because that's what this is all about in the end. Sam Sharpe. We have to put Sam Sharpe alongside a history of revolutionary reactions in the Caribbean region. This thing didn't just start yesterday. This has been going on all throughout. And it's right for us to memorialize Sharpe. But we have to go way back. The enslaved were never simply passive recipients of plantation brutality. And they were quite ingenious in the ways in which they resisted their oppression. 1736, in the island of Antigua, plantation owners discovered a plan by enslaved people to steal gunpowder and blow up the island's gentry at a ball. As punishment, over the following 6 months, 88 enslaved people were put to death, most of them by being burned alive. The leader of the plot, Prince Class, or Court, was born in Ghana. 1760, Taki's Rebellion. This was the largest uprising of enslaved people in a British colony in the 18th century. And Taki, is of Fanti origin, was the prominent figure who was royalty in his homeland. Inspired by the first Maroon Wars of the 1730s, Taki initiated a series of other uprisings on the island. We moved to Guyana, 1763. Kofi led a major slave revolt of more than 3,800 slaves against colonial regime. They militarily defeated their enslavers and placed a revolutionary government in power for almost a year. Have you ever heard of this? Grenada, 1796. Fedon's revolt in Grenada was defeated by British troops. It was inspired by the Haitian Rebellion, and the goal was to create an independent Black republic. When we come to 1804, this was not the first time that a rebellion that would have led to a republic was attempted. Guyana, Barbados, 1816. African-born Bussa, enslaved people along with him, rose up in Barbados and burned a quarter of the island's crop before the rebellion was suppressed. This is Great Britain's jewel colony. In Guyana, 1823, the leadership of Jack Gladstone, son of African-born Kwamina, under his leadership, rebellion broke out because of the lack of action of colonial authorities trying to improve the conditions of the slaves. An estimated 74,000 enslaved Africans in the colony, and about 10,000 took part in a rebellion. Interestingly, it was after the rebellion, this is 1823, just after this rebellion, there were two bishops sent to the Caribbean on two strategic islands, Barbados and Jamaica. After rebellion, you bring two bishops, and the goal is squash all of that rebellion. And then we come to Sam Sharpe, 1831. During a massive rebellion in Jamaica, more than 20,000 rebels seized control of the northwest corner of the island, setting planters' houses on fire. It took the British Army a month to restore order. 200 enslaved Africans and 14 white people died in fighting. At least 340 enslaved people who had rebelled were hanged or shot afterwards. This is a long history of rebellion. Were these simply struggles for survival? Or, rather, were these calculated and embodied theological responses to colonial oppression? In my latest book, I might be selflessly promoting. In my latest book, I make the claim that when considering that the rebellion in Jamaica in 1831 was spearheaded by a Baptist deacon, Sam Sharpe, and that the Haitian Revolution began as an African traditional religious observance, the claim can easily be justified that these were deeply theological responses to a pervasive Afrophobic colonial violence. The final three rebellions, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, signaled to the British Crown and Parliament that plantation slavery was becoming unstable, and more costs were being incurred in suppressing rebellion. And along with the fact that the plantations were delivering diminishing returns, if you know of Eric Williams, his thesis is that emancipation across the British colonies was an economic affair, over and above some moralistic sense. Abolitionism is often credited to British historical figures. It is something that we do with history. We love to eclipse the nuance of the story. But we think of William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and even John Newton. And then more recently, we start to think of Equiano and Sancho. But we forget that on the other side of the Atlantic, black people and enslaved were resisting, oppressing, and making things happen all along. They are abolitionists too. But let's look at Sam Sharpe. Archival evidence gives us some insights into Sharpe, particularly through the testimonies of his trial on the 19th of April, 1832. At a special slave court, that's a funny name, a special slave court. I wouldn't want to go to a special slave court. In Montego Bay, Sharpe was identified as the leader of the insurrection. He was examined and cross-examined by two white slaveholders, George Crawford Ricketts and William Stanford Grignon, respectively. Three magistrates presided over the trial: John Coates, Robert Thomas Downer, and Henry Augustus Plummer. The first two were slaveholders in the parish of St. James, and the final was the son of one of the biggest plantation owners in the district. And of course, if you have a trial like this, Sharpe was found guilty and executed on the 23rd of May, 1832. It's important to note that in 1830s plantation Jamaica, slaves could not testify against free persons, but could only do so against other slaves. Let's listen to some of the evidence from the dockets. This is a slave cross-examined, and this is the statement. The first place I saw Sharpe was at Retrieve. I did not see any other person swear the people but Sharpe. He had the book, Bible, read it and gave it to them. He gave them the book and said they must take their oath and not to work after Christmas unless they know what they were to work for. James Clark makes this statement in the court dockets. He says he knows the prisoner, Sam Sharpe, saw him coming through an interval of a cane piece at Cambridge about a week after Christmas, and he went towards Duckett's. He told me he was going to war and going to fight, and he asked me to go with him. And I said, I can't go. He said he was going up to Whittingham's way to Struy to fight white man. He had a short pistol, and walked before, and the party followed him. Half of the party had guns, and the others had lances and machetes. The next day in the afternoon, he returned by Hazelham way to Cambridge. He said he went to Struy and had had a battle there. They had fired a white man there, and the white man ran, and they ran after him and chopped him up and killed him. And the next morning, the party ate breakfast at George Reed's at Cambridge, and after breakfast, Sam Sharpe called all his men and said freedom was due to them a long time, and they must now seek to fight for it. And the one that fell back when they went to the battle, the others must shoot him. Some of the people called him Mr. Sharpe, and others just Sharpe. Nice freedom fighter. Final evidence from the court dockets. He says he knows Sharpe, the prisoner, met him at Hazelham, went there one night, a week before Christmas, to get some cane liquor. I went to Zink's house and saw 4 men came in beside Sharpe. One was Robert Rose and one Joe Martin. And Sharpe said, we must sit down. We free, and we must not work again unless we get half pay. He brought a Bible with him. He took it out and swore us all that we won't work again till we get half pay. Sharpe's strategy involved visiting the network of slaves, ministering to them as a Baptist deacon, good Christian, teaching the word of God, but also getting them to swear upon concrete action. The action was very specific. After Christmas, they were not to return to work. It might be worth remembering that Boxing Day and New Year's Day were the only 2 days that enslaved persons in the British West Indies, I have an issue with this word, but had free. They were sworn to a general strike. Sam, as a preacher, was a political actor, knew of transnational conversations about abolition, and that the morality of enslavement was in question. He was reading the biblical text from the standpoint of one seeking for justice, but also knowing that justice requires action and agency. My good friend Stephen Jennings wrote he's written this a long time ago, but this is what he says about Sharpe's theology. And this is an extended quote. I'll say some of it. Sharpe received his mandate to subvert from his reading of the following biblical texts. Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ. On Galatians 5:1, stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And Mark 6:24, no one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And there's a whole list of these texts that Sam Sharpe insisted upon. And Jennings says, for Sharpe, it was a matter of letting the word, in at least 3 senses of the word, become flesh. He and others were acting out what John's Gospel said about God's purpose for sending Jesus and Jesus' disciples into the world. Sharpe was very much a liberationist, and if you've been watching the news, one of the greatest theologians we know of this generation, Gustavo Gutierrez, passed away, the father of liberation theology. And I remember, I think it was in our library. I went in and Anthony Reddy was there. You know Anthony. And Anthony is a particular kind of person. That didn't come out too right. But he rebuked me. I said, Anthony, I was talking about liberation theology starting in Latin America. And Anthony, in Anthony fashion, said, I don't know why people always insist upon this. We've been fighting for liberation all along. So long before Gutierrez, there is a Sharpe, and the list goes back. Black people have been fighting for this all this time, theologically. It's unfortunate that we forget the grassroots and we don't publicize it. However, we must go beyond a two-dimensional view of Sharpe and the rebellion. This is where I want to get to with you, and embrace a multi-dimensional one. Yes, he's doing something theologically. Yes, he's an activist. He's a political agitator. He's an actor. He is still very aware of being a slave in a rigid and brutal system of enslavement. And his iconic statement encapsulates all of these multiple commitments. I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live my life in slavery. But there is an aspect that I want to explore. And if I'm correct, it underpins the political and the theological resistance that we love to credit Sharpe for. So I wonder if you could think for a minute and consider the fact that maybe Sam Sharpe was a Mayal man. I'll explain what that is. Any Jamaicans in here? Besides, you know what Mayal is? Bishop, I think the good Christian's about to kick me out. Hang on. As a theologian, my job is to complicate the historical record and the biblical context and see things more deeply and gain deeper insight. That's the job. This is what we do. We don't do surface. We can't afford to. And here are some assertions that I want to offer. Sam was a privileged slave and a Baptist deacon converted to Christianity in plantation society, Jamaica. Sam Sharpe read the Bible in light of his Christian faith and his experiences of the plantation, seeing slavery as contradictory to the teaching of the biblical text. Sam Sharpe was aware of the politics around this debate, yes, but Sam Sharpe was a black man and a slave and an African and an African Caribbean person. And this is a man who is so steeped in African traditional religious ideas around his time. We have to consider the connection between his faith and Obeah and Maoism. Maoism and Obeah in colonial African Caribbean society were thought to be opposite to each other. Mayal was about healing and Obeah was about destruction. However, the dichotomy is too simplistic. They're the same thing, the same function, and the function is liberation and healing. Sharpe's brand of Christianity was very much deeply informed by his African traditional religions and the complex relationship that they formed with the versions of Christianity taught by the missionaries. Sam Sharpe's preaching and conspiring, which led to that what authorities call an insurrection, was equally or even more so indebted to his ancestral religiosity. How can we think of this man as simply a Christian? You ever thought about this? Or simply a Baptist? Please don't ever look at me and think I'm just simply a priest. Before I continue to engage in this line of thinking, often when we think about Christianity and even the different denominations and confessions, we think of them in idealized ways. We very rarely tease apart all the ways in which they are influenced by culture or cultures, and generally how complex they are. This is the reason why this lecture is supported by the Center for Black Theology, and because at the heart of Black theology is the idea that there is no theology or church or confessional body that is neutral. In fact, it is when we refuse to acknowledge the cultural influences behind theology and church structures that we are engaging in some kind of colonial control. Any theology that presumes to be normative is perhaps the most toxic and destructive. So I ask you the question again. Let me pause and drink some water. I have a question, and it's worth pondering. It's worth pondering when we think of 1831 Jamaica, and for us right now. What kind of Christianity do we inhabit? Is it healthy? Is it fostering wholeness? And if it doesn't, what we can do about it? Have a little chat with each other. And if you're online, meditate. Seriously, I'm coming back to this in the end. What kind of Christianity do we inhabit? I'll give you 2 minutes. Have a chat. Okay, come back together. Because before the Baptists disown me, let me clear this up. I will try and come correct. Sam Sharpe should be considered in light of African traditional religions and heritage. Diane Sharpe is perhaps the foremost expert on African Jamaican spirituality. This is what she talks about in the book, 3 Eyes for the Journey. And she explicates who Sharpe is and how he functioned. And she locates Sharpe as a native Baptist, the group that was left somewhat unattended to by the Europeans after the missionary efforts of American Baptist George Liele. Missionary reports held that the native Baptists held an imperfect knowledge of the gospel. They preached Christ, but their practices were a curious mixture of African practices. Stewart explains that for some enslaved Africans, they were attracted to Christ because of his teachings and seeing them as endorsing black values. They saw through white missionary Christian values and ensured that their brand of faith valorized as well as criticized plantation Christianity. It was these values, very much indebted to African traditional religions and their convictions and practices, that inspired the resistance. Sam Sharpe used a network of native Baptists congregations to preach his gospel of liberation against the godlessness, as he saw it, of enslavement. This was his natural home. These were groups of Christians that Stewart emphatically frames as Christian Mialists. We assume that they were Baptist Christians first, having in our minds an idea that their faith was fundamentally European. Stewart dismisses this as illogical. They were African first, and their European doctrines, hermeneutics, symbolism, cosmology, and even linguistic structures were surface. This seems quite plausible in a context where the language was imposed, the faith was imposed, the rituals were imposed, and the liturgy was imposed. we forget how that which is often imposed continue to lie at the surface. Make no mistake, I'm a black man first. He's a black man. He's a slave. It's the depth of the African soul that incorporates, reorganizes, scrutinizes, reconceives, and reappropriates. This makes sense. Think about language. Think about patois. The words might be English. The grammar, the syntax, it ain't English. Just imagine how we speak with our body. What that means. What that means. You see, a bunch of black people laugh and they know. And you start sucking your teeth. Or we don't point with our hands, we do this. It ain't true? But that's so deep in us. It's not hard to imagine Sharpe as functioning as a Mayal man, a Christian preacher steeped in his own native religiosity, who at a fundamental level rejected Eurocentric Christianity as inherently false and dangerous to his kinfolk. But we cannot see this since we have learned to sanitize history with our binary thinking, choosing not to do the hard work of seeing behind the confines of our curated faith. Stuart reminds us that this was equally a problem in plantation Jamaica. The planters could not implicate Obeah Mayal's superstition as the true cause of the rebellion because they understood Obeah as poison and Mayal as heathen fetishism. They never conceived of Obeah as an entrenched African-derived religious framework that could sponsor social resistance with or without the use of poisons. It blows my mind. You don't think that people smart? We must also take Stuart's ultimate thesis seriously, and this is something that I really, this is very much a big part of my own intellectual journey. That Mayalized Christianity has been present in all forms of African Jamaican spirituality, whether explicitly Christian or reaction to missionary Christianity. She traces that with the native Baptists through to the revival Zionists of 1860s, to Rastafari of 1930s, in their own way, they show us a strong critique of missionary Christianity, beginning with Sam Sharpe. Stuart also critiques Caribbean theologians for making the error of not seeing that they were not Christian first. They were African first. Mayalized Christianity critiqued and contested much of the tenets of plantation Christianity, but under the veneer of orthodoxy. So I ask you a question. What kind of Christianity? And if you haven't thought about what kind of Christianity you inhabit, God help you. Because you have to. It is highly likely that Sharpe would have been contemplating the kinds of Christianity that permitted the brutality against African people. Particularly, he would also have been critiquing the tenets of the very Baptist tradition that shaped it. He did his hermeneutical work, going against the grain of mainstream Christian thinking. What must have been the process involved in this? This kind of hermeneutical shift is not something mental. This isn't a thought thing. You know it because you feel it. It's in your body. You live it every day. And often when we think of hermeneutical practices in the colonial and oppressive context, we assume that there would be some clear, abstract, removed reflection of the mysteries of faith. Oppressed people don't think theology. We live it amidst the most obscene and insidious circumstances of life. We must reframe Sharpe as someone whose theology was shaped by his experiences as an African slave on a slave plantation, whose recent and secondary religion was Christianity. He is a complicated figure who is both African and Baptist, a native Baptist. And as such, he represents a hybrid faith, still very much rooted in his ancestry and culture. He read the Bible through those lenses. He saw through the nature of plantation Christianity and through those lenses as well. So that's it about Sharpe. I want to turn to, but what kind of Christianity was he reacting to? Let's talk about plantation Christianity. If we consider the nature of plantation Christianity, I tend to make this point, and it's significant. Christianity did not come into the Caribbean. A version of it did. A Christianity that engenders such violence and destruction and acts in such unempathetic ways can only be framed in what I would call psychopathological terms. It was deeply disturbed and psycho-spiritually unhealthy as an entity. Scholars from the Caribbean have for many generations problematized the kinds of society that Europeans established across its empires. They also problematized the kinds of Christianity that attended this expansion. Orlando Patterson was the first to offer the thesis that plantation society was a non-society, that slavery was, according to many scholars, a total institution. Its chief purpose for the colonies was one thing only: profit. And I say this all the time with as much passion as I can, and it gets to me. These were highly calibrated systems of violence concerned with the economic enhancement of Europe. These were not places to develop families, to imagine a new future, to have children, to plan for retirement, to live a good life that was stress-free. These were workhouses where the lives of enslaved were meticulously prescripted towards production or destruction in every possible way. You were worked to death. You were raped to death. Should I go on? And the church, particularly the Planters Church, was to ensure that the system remained precisely calibrated. What kind of Christianity is that? Ian Strachan, another voice from the Caribbean, argues that the shaping of the region through colonial expansion had a theological foundation solely concerned with imperial power. In the European Christian imagination, the enslaved were not human and could not be Christian in the way that Europeans were. Similarly, they could not be civilized in the way that Europeans were, or worthwhile as the way that Europeans were. They had a place, and that was servitude. Caribbean psychologist Frederick Hickling explores this issue from a psychological lens. He has a little book called Cycles of Elmina. Before the summer, I had the chance to go to Ghana. Have any of you gone to one of those castles? Slave Coast Castle, Elmina? Okay. Well, as a Caribbean going, I don't think I've stopped processing this. It's one of these things, when you've studied enslavement for so long, your soul can only do so much processing. But I needed to go, and Ghana needed to have me. That's how I felt. We needed to reconnect. There was something wholeness making about it, and very important. But he writes this book after going to Elmina Castle. And he makes a number of assertions. We must theorize African Caribbean life psychologically in light of the event of the project of enslavement. Whatever it was a psychological process that continues to reverberate into the present lives of African people, diasporan Africans, etc. Secondly, European white supremacy is a psychological process, a kind of psychosis. Germane to this psychosis is the deep belief that people of color and indigenous inhabitants of the rest of the world are subhuman, only slightly superior to the domestic animals. That's a psychosis. And thirdly, this psychosis and the cycles of psychopathology affect every aspect of Black and African Caribbean life, especially religion. He writes, there is growing evidence from psychiatry, psychology, sociology, economics, and anthropology that the ravages of African slave trade has profoundly affected the thinking, feeling, and behavior of African people at home and abroad. Black and whites were psychologically damaged. Slavery discouraged independent judgment and self-reliance in blacks, who were encouraged not to question anything and to lead a primitive lifestyle. The damaging psychological effects of slavery, of slaves being torn from their families and sexually abused, can be seen in the different slave narratives and autobiographies. And he further points out that the destructive nature of European colonization through both Christianity and Islam have always to contend with African traditional religions and philosophy. Because while they have been called pagan or primal, they pre-existed Christianity and Islam for millennia. A number of Caribbean theologians make the point that actually Christianity never went to the final stage of becoming a religion of the people. And certainly Ashley Smith, I think his thesis still holds sway, that the church in the Caribbean continues to be an import, a potted plant. What kind of Christianity do we inhabit? Christianity in the African Caribbean has been a violent entity, both deeply entangled with the imperial project. It has been overtly violent through the support and maintenance of brutal colonial society. It has been inwardly violent and in terms of the psychological and hermeneutical structures that permitted and sustained such violence. Sam Sharpe was not simply protesting something that was outwardly violent, but something that was deeply inwardly and even subconsciously violent and soul-breaking. With this in mind, we can appreciate the words of Bob Marley: emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. I ain't talking about outward things. I'm talking about deep here. Let's move on. Let's talk about healing. I talk a lot about breaking. Can I talk to you about some healing? Okay. When we interrogate the Mileless tradition further, we come to see that it's fundamentally about wholeness. In the context of anthropological annihilation of a slave plantation, somehow, some way, you have to reconstruct the brutalized soul. Where do you do it if your Christianity is the one brutalizing it? Stewart traces the trajectory of nihilism in Jamaican religiosity and culture, arguing that there is a systematic renewal in it, a systematic renewal of the culture towards wholeness. Beneath a history of vilification and suppression, nihilism transforms into various cultural traditions: Native Baptist, revivalism, Kumina, Rastafari, even dancehall. All of these are complicated things, but there is something about remembering the soul, remember the soul. And there is an impulse within African traditional religions to remember the self. There is a sense of anamnesis, and if you If you're Eucharistic or do Holy Communion, or if you're an Anglican like me, it's about making the past present and bringing all the fullness into the present, becoming whole again. And these function in this way. These aspects, and Stuart talks about a number of different aspects that are part of this remembering process. This act of remembering, bringing back together, of healing of the soul, is something that, going back to Frederick Hickling, he very much talks about. In the Cycles of Elmina, he makes a similar observation as Diane Stewart does when thinking about Rastafari. This is his quote: Rastafari emerged in Jamaica in the early 20th century as an antidote to the delusional European ideology, using the psychological mechanisms of negation and encapsulations, and has resulted in an antithetical psychological and cultural formation that has swept the world. The resultant formulation has produced a black-led popular music that has antithetically replaced the religious and cultural expressions of the delusional European identity by a culture of freedom that has profoundly rejected the delusions of white privilege, that has catalyzed a spontaneous, irrevocable cultural therapy process, providing the basis for a worldwide, ongoing cultural healing and the liberation of people of color. That's a whole lot of words. Let me make it clear for you. And I make this point, again, in my book, Caribbean Contextual Theology. You know the song, One Love. Sing it. Okay, you're doing good, you're doing good. And we know this one. You know, we know this. And listen to the words. Let's get together and feel all right, as it was in the beginning. So shall it be in the end. But sing Babylon System for me. Hello? We refuse to be what you wanted us to be. We are what we are. That's the way it's going to be if you don't know. You can't educate I for no equal opportunity. Talking about my freedom. Talking about my freedom, people, freedom and liberty. Yeah, we've been trodden on the wine press much too long. Rebel. Rebel. This is what Bob says. And the song goes on. Babylon system is the vampire, sucking the children day by day. We say Babylon system is the vampire, falling empire, sucking the blood of the sufferers, building church and university, deceiving the people continually. We say graduating thieves and murderers. Look how they suck in the blood of the sufferers. Now, which Bob we want? One love is good. You also talk about rebellion. Both go together. Just like Sam Sharpe. Another voice taking up this idea of remembering is our own Delroy Hall, who's a redemption song. It might be in the bookstall, I'm not sure. But he does a kind of pastoral theological reflection from a Black British perspective. He uses this idea of anamnesis, looking at Sam Sharpe. Here's what he says. Sharpe's multi-layered life and the various strands it crossed is complex. But within this framework, it is possible that he could have been a wounded healer. The term was coined by depth analyst Carl Jung, who used the Greek legends about Chiron to describe it. A healer who received an incurable wound from a poison arrow, and about Asclepius, another healer who was wounded and killed by a thunderbolt from Zeus for taking healing art beyond human bounds in raising the dead. For Hall, Sharpe must be framed in psychological terms concerned with healing and wholeness, inhabited a kind of Christianity that is Eucharistic and insistent on remembering the body. Anamnesis and communion are key concepts in his reflection. Sharpe's efforts are not simply about freedom from enslavement, but there is something deeper than fighting for freedom. You don't fight for freedom. You also fight for wholeness and newness. And let's frame him in this way. My argument ultimately is that expressive forms of Christianity like that of Sharpe are deeply embedded in the African Caribbean context, are pneumatologically oriented ways in which there is a total and should be a total well-being for the community, for the person and the community. These involve spirit possession, dreams and visions, healing power of herbs, and not simply only resistance. How do I remember myself? Fact. If Frederick Hickling says that Rastafari presents a cultural therapy towards healing within the Mayal tradition, what do we do with Rastafari? What have we done? Okay, Windrush generation, late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, then all of a sudden in this country, your children became Rastafarian. What do you do with the Rastafarian with the long dreadlocks? You lock them up. You marginalize them. You call them ganja people. And you beat them to the ground. Or maybe they were trying to show us the truth. But we do it to ourselves. In my work, and this has been a lifetime journey, what moves me, I do not want to live with the kinds of tension and dissonance in my faith, where my faith tells me I'm not worthwhile. That's the most violent of all. Here are some concluding thoughts for you and for me. Ultimately, Christianity in the African Caribbean, especially through historical figures such as Sam Sharpe, remind us to pay attention to all the ways that our practices of Christianity are harmful and destructive. Who do we marginalize? Who do we scapegoat? Who do we put all the sin and blame on? We have to watch this. Colonial and racist systems and structures are often normalized and deeply embedded within both church and society. The way we read scripture and practice Christianity should ultimately aim to locate and address these often hidden realities. And perhaps we can do this in several ways. I'll suggest two. Firstly, we must pay attention to how we practice our faith. We can often be engaged in the ritual and remain locked into our rhythms of life and worship. Fine, no problem. However, we must consider the ways in which others are ignored or denied or even harmed because of our faith practices. I'm sorry. Put me on record. The church is often one of the most toxic places ever. and it need healing itself. I would say it need exorcism sometimes, but it certainly need healing. And I'm not talking just the church at large, churches. I don't care where you come from. Unless we look at ourselves, who can we talk to? For Sharpe, the Christian church in the colony of Jamaica preached the love of God as revealed in Jesus Christ, but supported and enforced the emotional, spiritual, and physical brutality towards African enslaved persons. What the church did not see was its own deeply embedded racism and its deep belief that black people were not human beings as white were. I call that demonic. Secondly, we must pay attention to how we read Scripture and how we think about God and God's involvement in the world. Sharpe represents something for me of a prophetic figure. And prophetic figures are funny characters because they're never inside. They're always on the margin somehow in the desert and thinking in odd ways because they pursue something deeper. And Sharpe is somebody you cannot hold down too tightly. But he read the signs. He was not only critical of enslavement, he was also deeply suspicious of his own formation in the faith. He had people swearing on the Bible to go against what the planters wanted. His radical action suggests that he had processed his own complicity in a denomination and tradition that needed deep change. Sam Sharpe's faith urged him to seek wholeness both in society and in his own Christian tradition. Plantation Christianity remains very colonial and deeply problematic because of a particular tendency to valorize the European or the Western or the American, but displace and subjugate local practices and epistemologies and ways of knowing and being in the world. Sharpe is not a Baptist deacon alone. He's a black man on a slave plantation, steeped in his own culture. Now let's return to the questions for you. I pose it again. I believe that we inhabit Christianities that are in many ways still deeply colonial. Just check how power is exercised. Look at your church. Ask yourself, how is power exercised? I'll tell you a little joke and then I'll end. I mean, it wasn't funny on the day, but I kind of always put my foot in it. I was doing something on the Holy Spirit at a black-led church and going off into all these wonderful ideas about expressive Christianity. And I didn't know that in the room, because we were all very casual, big-time bishops. And so I asked the pastor who invited me, who's a woman, so why aren't there women bishops? I was like, oh, Jesus, I didn't know that I was getting myself in problems. The place was quiet, because I was sitting next to the bishop. But the truth is, we have to learn to see. And there's so much clouding our seeing. And to see properly is a long journey, and it's a brave one. And much of it is unconscious. Much of it is psychopathological. And we have to be brave, like Sharpe. So what kind of Christianity do you inhabit? If you're honest, is it healthy? Is it fostering existential wholeness? Wholeness on all levels. And if not, how do we address it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Turner. Carlton, if we can from here on. It's been very stimulating, thought-provoking, and challenging. And I would like to invite us here in the chapel here at Queen's to have a conversation with your neighbour, person behind you, to try and address those same questions yourselves. And then when we come back, we'll take a question from you in the room and online. And again, what kind of Christianity do we inhabit? In this room, we have people, black people, white people, a range of diverse looking people from diverse churches. Is there a church, or the whole lot of them, Carlton, that you might want to talk about later? But here are the questions again. What kind of Christianity do we inhabit? Is it healthy? Is it fostering existential wholeness? And here's a question for you in your group. If not, how do we address this? Have a conversation, and for you online, this is your chance to send us your question, your comment, more I should say, because we have quite a few, so thank you. But this is your chance to use the QR code and to email your comment or questions. And in 5 minutes' time, after you've had another drink of water, Carlton, we'll come back and interrogate you.
I'm ready.
Okay, good. So have a conversation, and we look forward to your questions and comments online.
Is it on? Is it?
Yes, okay. Thank you, everyone. This is the moment where we have a chance to engage with Carlton with his fantastic paper and lots and lots of questions coming through and comments. We'll go to a question online first, if that's okay, and it's hard to know where to start, Carlton. You've got them in front of you. We've got some topical questions, and we've got some theological questions as well. So let's start then, should we, with a question that came in relation to theology. Let's have a look. This person says, thanks for the lecture, Carlton. Anonymous, which is fine. You use two different terms, missionary Christianity and plantation Christianity. Do you view those as the same thing? Or do you see a difference? And if so, what is the difference for you?
Okay. This is a good observation.
Okay.
So in general, what I mean by missionary Christianity is the kind of Christianity that moved across the empire to the colonies, whether that's English-speaking, French-speaking, whatever, and the denomination. So for us, in the English-speaking context, the British context, you would have had Baptist, Anglican, and you would have had that spread across the world. When I talk about plantation Christianity, I'm talking about something that is very much related to it, but established in the colonies, and sometimes these have tensions. One of the interesting things about the Caribbean, slaves who were the slave masters had their own kind of power base. They were the Church of England in the colonies, or the Presbyterian, or the Church of Scotland, or whatever. When missionaries came that challenged them in any way, for simple things like teaching slaves to read, they had issues. Why would you teach animals to read? So you had in the history of the region a tension between missionaries and planters. And this is across the board. So sometimes I use this term plantation Christianity to talk generally about how Christianity was on the plantation. And sometimes I'm talking about the Christianity that moves across the Atlantic. But it's the same kind of deeply Eurocentric thing anyway, just that they're having their own tensions. So it's complicated. Good observation for whoever that person is.
Okay, I'll take two more questions before we come to the chapel here at Queen's. In what ways did colonial Christianity then both support and undermine the quest for freedom amongst enslaved people as exemplified by Sharpe's rebellion?
Okay. Sorry, I'm looking for it here. Say it again, Dulcie.
The second one. In what ways can Sharpe's legacy inspire current movements? That's a different question, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's so many. They're good ones. In what ways did, this is the question, in what ways did colonial Christianity both support and undermined the quest for freedom among enslaved people, as exemplified by Sharpe's?
I find it a strange one, how it's put, support. Anyway, my reaction to this is the only kind of support can come if you continue to beat people and suppress them, they're going to react. So you're helping the process. If that's what they mean, I have no idea.
Okay,
Tell them have a conversation with me.
Yes.
But know who they are first.
Okay, put your name. Let's hear one more question. And I mentioned earlier that there's some topical questions. Chris Kober comes to mind. But let me jump away from that for the moment. We might come back to that and ask you this one. Would Sam Sharpe have been invited at today's gathering of the Commonwealth leaders? And what would he tell our leaders about apology and where to direct future reparations? And before you answer that, you know, our Prime Minister is wanting to move on and not to address reparations. So if you had the chance to sit with Sir Starmer, what would you say? So there's two questions there.
Oh, me, Carlton?
Yes.
Oh, Jesus. I did not come here for this. Let me be a politician. Listen, I think the conversation about reparations will not go away. I mean, the fact is, I usually have this approach. We are tied together across the Atlantic. The depletion there means the increase here. The foundations here means the exploitation there. And historically, we cannot move beyond this. This has to be talked out, thought through, dealt with appropriately. It's just how we do it, but we can't avoid it. Now, we could be radical, we could have long-term strategies, but it ain't gonna be easy, but we can't avoid it. That's as much as I can say on this matter. Okay. And it's necessary.
Would Sam Sharpe have been invited, do you think?
Yeah, he was dead, he was gonna get killed. No. No. Yeah, anyway, I'm being tongue-in-cheek, but...
Okay. All right, we'll come back to online questions afterwards. Do we have any questions in the room, as in the chapel here at Queen's?
Nothing hard.
We will come to you with the mic, if that would help. Great, thank you. Hi, sir.
Thank you so much. I'm Simon J, Baptist minister. Thanks so much for your talk. Absolutely riveted. Brilliant talk. I have, so this question is around African spirituality. I have a statue in my house, Isu Elegbara. So I think Henry Lewis Smith talks about him, the signifying monkey theory. So how, I occasionally take this statue into churches. Yeah. When talking about African spirituality and how we decolonize our church services. Yeah. It terrifies people. Yeah. The subject of African spirituality in churches terrifies people. And sometimes I get a bit worried. How much could we, do you think, when talking about this, bring African spirituality within our churches to challenge the European focus of it? Do you think that's something that you'd encourage to do, or do you think that's something that we go, oh, dodgy?
I try it. I remember there was an Easter, and we had, I spent 8 years as a parish priest in Walsall, in the Black Country. And I remember we had our own, I did creative things with the liturgy. And then at the end, I had a series of pictures of a post-resurrection Jesus. And the last one was the Messiah Jesus. And I just noted a few congregation members went, I'm a black man as your minister. But they went, and I think that shock is, well, that tells you how deep the issues are. And it's really about being open to otherness. So I wouldn't put the onus so much on you introducing it. My question would be, how much openness and diversity does your context have or is able to deal with? Because if they can't deal with that, that means something's not happening. And it's a theological issue, you know. Because if you're not able to see this very concrete thing as an other thing that you can wrestle with that's before you, you can't see what's going on with you as you read that biblical text. Your faith becomes very, very simplistic, very monochrome, mono everything. But it's not complex. It's not deep. So I would say, please do. This is the prophetic task. Keep doing it, little by little.
Thank you, Simon. Selena?
Oh, Jesus.
Thank you very much, Carlton. I really respect you so much, and I would like to read it properly again. So my question is about healing and what it means for us to embrace healing rituals, communal rituals, because you were speaking about healing of the soul, and you were hinting at healing of the mind, this kind of liberation of the mind. And I was immediately thinking, what does it mean for that not to be an individualized process? What does it mean for us to discern those rituals of communal healing? Because we talk about healing a lot these days, and it tends to be the wealthier people who can afford to go to therapy. And I'm just wondering what it means for us to have that kind of healing that doesn't depend on us attaining certain kinds of wealth in order to access it, if that makes sense.
I could give you a long answer to that. I'll try and be short, because I'm passionate about this very same thing. Remember I said there's no idealized Christianity. We've received a version of Christianity. At the heart of the Christianity we've received, I think we need to be careful because we are tied into a very individualistic, capitalistic kind of Christianity that is steeped in a kind of ideal type, and it serves an ideal type, a white European or Euro-American person. And we need to deal with that. We need to deconstruct that, okay? But what we do is we throw away indigenous knowledges, systems that were inherently very much about wholeness and the community. And I know that might be simplistic as a statement, but generally that is the case. So for example, if we stick with what we're talking about today and Rastafari, just as an example, or Kumina. Kumina, how many Jamaicans in here? How many of you know what I mean when I say Kumina? Okay, you're talking about a healing tradition. You're talking about when you dance in community. There is a reason why we beat the drum in a circle. I'm a Junkanoo person. Carnival is about community. The spirit comes at the heart of this celebration. But why can't that be reflected in our worship? And it's unfortunate because I think the early church is very much community. They were gathered together in one room, praising God and worshiping. And the Spirit came down and everything turned upside down and started speaking in tongues. They thought they were drunk. They were so high on the Spirit, but they were together. It wasn't about, I feel good. They held all things in common, and they grew, and the testimony was, oh, how they love one another. And I think it could be as simple as that. But we move away from our ancestries. We've also moved away from the earth. We moved away from connectedness. I grew up as you know, on an island in the Bahamas, very rural. Listen, I always missed the sea. Like I missed the rhythm of the ocean. Every painting in my house probably has something to do with the sea. I feel the sea. I feel my land. It's all I know. And it's still there. And I think we need to get back to some ancient things, but we sell it all away for money. Or fame, or popularity, or fashion. And I think we need to do that work. There's an Anglican in the back.
Thank you. Can we use that in? Baptist.
So the William Knibb, I think, I'm not a historian, but you have two responses to this rebellion that breaks out in 1831. William Knibb, who was later arrested further on, and this is why we might esteem him as somebody on the other side doing this work. But he fundamentally disagreed with Sam Sharpe. While Sam Sharpe insisted on this sit-out, or sick-out, whatever you want to call it, he did not want to touch the planters class and the production. His encouragement was, don't do this. Just keep things as they were. So it's much more complicated than this, because you have two different approaches. And I think like everything, when we trace things historically, it's always, it's not 100% of this or the other. You have to weave through this complex thing. But he stands apart from Sharpe in this. And your second point had to do with conditioning of Christianity. And I think I'll just say this quickly, and this responds to a whole lot of things I'm talking about. Why is it, for those Anglicans in the room from the Caribbean, we still inhabit a kind of Christianity that is of Great Britain from 100 years ago? And we haven't moved forward in any significant way. That's the power of colonialism. And the outward trappings are still there. But have we wrestled with the question, why? And that's a big word.
Thank you for that question, Wayne. Let me come into the shop. You just mentioned the colonialism, and I want to problematize that even more with this question online. And you mentioned exorcism earlier.
Oh, hallelujah.
And I think it was Robert Beckford that talked about Christians being bewitched.
Very provocative, yes.
So here's the question for you, Dr. Turner. How can the black-led churches pull away from the colonized teaching and preaching of the gospel? And do you think black-led churches fear white supremacy?
I don't know what the last one exactly means. So whoever raised the question, if you could say more, that would be helpful. But I'll approach it this way, Dulcie. I think colonialism is a particularly insidious thing. And you might react to the colonizer's church and then inhabit it and become an all-black church and still be just as colonial. Because what we're talking about isn't skin color. We're talking about power and how power is exercised and who is sacrificed at the expense of it. And I think the tricky bit is, I'm Church of England, that's all I know, and we have some issues. We ain't the only one who have issues. Black church-led churches can be just as toxic on top of all of this other stuff. And this is why I ask the question to all of us. What kind of Christianity do we inhabit? And to that person, this idea of pulling away from colonialism, I would say that's deep work. It sounds like the kind of work that a certain first century Palestinian Jew called Jesus of Nazareth ready for. Because he like turned things upside down and beat people and run them out of the temple. And he is just different because he sees through the falsity of what pretends to be truth and holiness. And he does something about it. And that's deep work.
I have one last question for you, Carlton, I think. Thank you for all the questions and comments online. I will share them with Dr. Turner. Sam Sharpe died at the young age of 28. He was hung.
Such a baby.
Such a baby indeed. If you had the chance to have a conversation with Sam Sharpe, how would that conversation go?
I think when we talk about a conversation, we think, and I talk about this a lot, we think head, cognition, intellect. I would want to know what moves this man, what vibrates within him. I want to talk spirit. Because we all can see what needs to be done. This is as clear as day. That's one thing to see something critically, but what about inspiration? That's what I would want from him. And I think we don't do enough of that. You know, we want to talk it out, but we ain't dealing with the deep movements within. I probably don't answer the way you want, whoever that is.
We'll have that conversation in the dining room later.
Okay.
But let me just ask this then, that chimes with that, and thank you for this question. With the legacy of Sam Sharpe, how as a theologian, do you establish a parallelism with the theology of, no, it's not that one, sorry about this. This is the question I want to ask. There's so many, but and they're so very good, but this one here, in what ways, to finish off this Sam Sharpe Lecture 2024, in what ways can Sharpe's legacy inspire current movements for justice and equality, especially within religious communities?
In religious communities. Yes. I really think what the history books don't say enough, Sharpe was carrying out his own kind of Baptist faith, and at a cost. And when we look at Baptist history, we want to idealize him as a Baptist thing. But it's a heavy thing to critique your own faith. And only prophets and courageous people can do this. But it's the only path to a deeper faith, a more whole faith, when we realize that the things we held as unchanging and for all time and untouchable were nonsense. I think Jesus does this a lot. He challenges our perceptions, the things we held as true. You have heard it said this, but I tell you. And that's courage. That's a lot of courage.
Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner, I want to say thank you for bringing us this lecture. Thank you, everyone. So we look forward to the next book, and we'll have a chance to have a conversation with you later. So one more time, please, for Dr. Turner, as we say thank you. We're coming to a close here in the Chapel Queen's Foundation, and before we go, I want to invite the founder of this great annual event, the Sam Sharpe Lecture. Please welcome Rosemary Davidson.
calls me to say all the other bits of thank yous. I'm always humbled each year that this actually happens. It doesn't happen out of nothing, and it takes the best part of a year and a bit to organize. And to do that, it takes a small group, and I do mean a small group, of very, very faithful, overworked, very hard-working people. Some are here, others are not here. And I'd like to name at least one or two. Mary Parker, who sends you those emails, reminding you where to go and what time to get here. Thank you, Mary. They got here. And sending out the links to those people online. Well done. You got online, and that's because of Mary Parker, who does this in addition to a lot of other things that she is responsible for. And also, somebody who likes to cower away from the light, which is why I'm here and he's not, Wale Hudson-Roberts, who puts a lot of time, effort, and energy into this, always asking the question, who's going to be our next speaker? Where is it going to be? Who do we need to pull on board? And he does this very much within the background, pushing people forward, encouraging people to step up. And he's in the room with his head down. And I'd like you to show your appreciation for him, for without this, it wouldn't happen. But we also do these lectures in partnership with other people who allow us to use beautiful spaces like this and who work with us in doing the small details. And in this case, we have Dulcie and Rebecca. Where are you? Each and every meeting, what about this? What about that? It really is important to work in partnership. When we work in partnership, this is what we get. This. And also food, hot food, not sandwiches. Not saying anything more than that. And it's the first time we've been able to do that, and we've been able to do that because of the hard work of Dulcie and Rebecca. So ladies, please take your stand. And also the catering staff who fed us and catered and welcomed us so beautifully. They probably, I don't know if they can hear us, so just in case they can't hear us, could we do a louder than usual? And there are so many other people who have done little things and big things, encouraged, passed on the link, invited other people to come along. And you've taken time, traveled, some just across the way, some a bit further afield. People who I have seen every single year for the past 10, 11 years. Every single year, they find a way to find wherever we are to sit down and listen to another thought-provoking, challenging time, a lecture where they can ask questions, vibe with people, engage with new friends and old. And we really, really hope that we get to see you again next year. We've got a good one for you. We've got a real treat. Next year we will have Dr. Selina Stone delivering our lecture. It will be in London. So let's hope the trains behave and the traffic behaves. And we would love to welcome you. It'll be in East London University. And there's a lot of history in that part of London, a lot of history of rebellion and social change. And if you get a chance to come down a bit earlier and walk around and do that, you should do that. You will not regret it. But thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting these lectures. And we really hope that as you leave from here, you have questions and other things whirling around in your head that will keep going through for the rest of the year, that you'll phone up your friends and say, did you know, or I was challenged about this. Please do take the opportunity to listen to the lecture again online and come back. See you next year to the Sam Sharpe Lectures. Thank you.